Okay, so all that done. I'll give Isaac a second because I didn't want all that on live. All right, so John chapter 21, you have this moment, right, where Peter and some of the apostles go out and decide to do some fishing, and it's complete failure. They catch nothing. Jesus shouts out to them, "Have you caught anything?" And they say, "We haven't caught anything." And Jesus then says to them, "Cast your net." Some translations or text say on the other side, or on this narrative we read through the New King James says on the right side. In other words, don't keep casting the nets in the same place. Let's do something different, Jesus says. Let's try another approach. Let's throw the nets on the other side. And when they do that, there's so many fish in the nets that they can't even pull it all in to the boat. It's amazing sometimes how we get into such ruts that we would continue to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again with absolutely no benefit and no effect. And somehow we've convinced ourselves at times that if we just keep doing it, that one out of these 1 billion times that I've done this, surely it'll have the effect and benefit that I'm looking for. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes I need to evaluate what it is that I'm doing, how it is I'm approaching that work or purpose, and I might need to say to myself, it's time to do something different. It's time to approach this circumstance or that set of problems or this issue in my life. It's time for a new approach to that because what I've been doing hasn't reached the effective results that I've been looking for. This morning, let me put the disclaimers out there. We're not talking about doing something other than the testimony of Scripture. We're not talking about doing something beyond what God has taught within the narrative of His Word. But what we're saying is there are lots of ways to do the things that God has told us to do. There may be lots of ways, expediencies is the fancy word we use sometimes as it relates to that. But there might be lots of expedient ways to accomplish the same purposes that God has given us. And at times we need to be willing to say, it's time to do something different. That we might have the results that God would desire for us in our work and service to Him. And so let's talk together about this subject this morning. And my remote has quit working, so I'm going to set it right there and I'll use the manual way. Let's talk about this idea of when I'm resisting what is right, it's time to do something different. Would you think about Saul of Tarsus for a moment here in Acts chapter 9 and verse 1. In Acts chapter 9 and in verse 1, I want you to see something that happens in the life of Saul of Tarsus. Remember, he's been the chief troublemaker for all things Jesus. He has been bringing folks and imprisoning them. He's been wreaking havoc on the Lord's people from the moment they began to answer the gospel there in Acts chapter 2. He's standing there when Stephen is stoned to death, and he consents to that. He holds the coats of those who had stoned Stephen to death. And we find him now traveling in order to continue breathing out threats, verse 1 says, and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He goes to the high priest and asks letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now I can only imagine for a moment what that must have been like. As Saul was traveling along the road, and all of a sudden he's having a conversation with the Lord. And the Lord asks a very basic question, Saul, why are you doing this? You know, I don't know whether we don't have any record of knowing. It'd be interesting to think just for a moment about, did Paul really know why? Did Saul, I should say at that stage, he's not known as the Apostle Paul yet, did Saul of Tarsus really have a full appreciation of why? Maybe so, because later texts teach us that he said, while I did those things, I was doing it all in good conscience. He felt that it was the right thing to do as a follower of Judaism at that time. But Jesus asked the very sobering questions. Why are you persecuting me? And Saul of Tarsus says, who are you, Lord? And then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Here's the point I want you to see. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Some translations say it's hard for you to kick against the pricks. If you recall, sometimes when you'd have an ox cart, you'd have the oxen yoked to that cart, there would be some pricks that if they tried to back up instead of moving forward, they would hit the goads or the prick and it would move them forward. And Jesus says to Saul of Tarsus, why do you continue to kick against the goads? Why are you continuing to be injurious to yourself? Why are you continuing to be your own worst enemy? Why do you continue to resist what you know to really be right? You know, it's an interesting concept. Jesus understood and appreciated. And it's an amazing thing when you think about it, that all the while Saul of Tarsus is dragging men and women into prison, consenting to their death, and all the challenges that he's doing, the whole while, Jesus basically says to him, you know what was really right and wrong in this circumstance the whole time. You're resisting that which is true. You are resisting that which is right. And how many times in my own life, if I've known exactly what Jesus or the Scriptures have wanted me to appreciate, I've known exactly what the Bible has said about something, I know the behaviors and choices that I have been making are not nearly what God would say are right in His sight. And I continue to push myself against those pricks, against those goads. They're prodding me and reminding me and telling me that it's time for me to do something different. I don't know how many times I'd have to be goaded before hopefully I would realize it's time to change and quit resisting what is right. When I feel trapped by those very choices, when I'm feeling like I'm stuck, it's time to maybe think a little differently. Go back into the Old Testament example of Jonah. Old Testament example of Jonah. And I want you to just think for a few moments. You remember the basic account, right? Jonah's told by God, go in to Nineveh, preach to them that God is going to bring forgiveness to them, and there's change coming on the horizon. Jonah didn't want to do that. So he tries to flee the scene. He ends up in a boat. He ends up off the boat and in the belly of a great fish. I want you to pick up the story here in verse 1 of chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. Not literally, obviously, but have you ever felt like you were in the belly of a fish? Don't you think about that for a minute? Okay, even though it's a great fish, it still is a great fish. And I imagine the belly of a fish, even a great one, is still a pretty confining and restricting place to find yourself, right? It's some of those imageries that we have of that. You kind of see those cartoonish like pictures, and there's this great big whale, and inside of it is a little teeny tiny Jonah, and he's almost got a little fire built there, right? You've seen those imageries. No, he's in the belly of a real fish, a great fish, confining and restricting. It is not a pleasant place for him to be. And while he's in the belly of that fish, he cries out to the Lord, verse 2, because of my affliction. And he answered me, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me, and all your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. I've been cast out of your sight, but it's time for me, Jonah says, to do something different. I tried to run away from you. I tried to run away from the responsibilities you had given me. I tried to ignore the things that you were instructing me to do. And it is time for me to cast my eyes back to you. It's time for me to get focused again and remember the importance of a relationship with my Creator. The beauty of that is that even though Jonah is in the belly of a fish, he still has hope and confidence that through this prayer and his communication with his Father, that he can remedy this situation that's so confining and so feeling of just being trapped. The water surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. When I feel trapped and confined, when I feel weak, when I feel like there's no real answer, He remembers where genuine answer comes from. And though it was His own choosing and His own decision making and His own process of thinking that put Him in this circumstance to begin with, He recognizes that there is still hope so long as he reaches out to God. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah unto dry land. I don't know about you, but I don't expect that was a very pleasant experience either. Right? I imagine the idea of having to exist for several days inside the belly of the fish was a problem within itself. I don't imagine it was a very pleasant experience to be vomited. There's a reason why that word is used to describe the sea. As Jonah describes what happened to him, he describes it as being vomited out from that. But you know, sometimes when we are in the depths of sin and challenges, when we are confined by the very choices and decisions that we make, it takes the force sometimes of that imagery to forcibly get us into something different. To start making better decisions and better choices, and to reach out to our God and say, I have created this problem. I have trapped myself in this circumstance by my choosing and my decisions. But Lord, I reach out to you for salvation. In my life, it is time for something different. It is time for some change. And I may have to go through the excruciating feeling of being vomited out onto dry ground. But if that's what it takes to make change that is necessary in my life, so be it. Because if my choices are to go through that experience and have the ability to reconnect with my Creator again, or to remain in the belly of that fish, then I'll take the temporary hardship of making those changes in my life that are necessary, that I might have the reward of a relationship with God. Do something different. When you feel like you've trapped yourself in your choices, start making different decisions and different choices, and go through the difficult moments that it might take to make the changes that bring you back to your Creator. What I'm doing isn't effective. Maybe it's time for change. Let me share with you two texts. Go into Mark chapter 6 and verse 11. Mark chapter 6 and verse 11. Jesus is commissioning His apostles to go out, begin the process of sharing His message. And He says this in verse 11 of chapter 6 of Mark. He says, and whoever will not receive you nor hear you, when you depart from there, shake off the dust under your feet as a testimony against them. Assuredly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Jesus tells His apostles, you may go into some places and you may be completely ignored. There may not be anyone interested whatsoever in hearing the message that you're presenting to them. Now, you can day after day after day after day after day after day and have the same results and the same results. Or you can decide, you know what, it's time for my energies and efforts to be put forth somewhere else and shake the dust. And the imagery of that, friends, I don't believe that idea is that, well, who cares about them then? I think that's kind of an overstating of it. It's not a matter of just kind of, well, I don't even care about them. If they weren't interested, and I'm just going to shake the dust off. It's not an angry tone. It's a tone of it's time to move on then. There are others that may be able to be reached. There are others who may be more responsive. There are others who may be responsive. So it may be time to move on. I don't think the Lord ever commends us or commissions us, if you will, to just continue to do the same things over and over and over again without any result or effectiveness. I think He would want us to employ some wisdom to know that, hey, it's time. That's not working. And so let's shake the dust and let's go do something else to try to present the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For them, it might have been find a new audience. For us, it might be find a new means. But do something different. If it's not having the effectiveness that we and ultimately God would desire. Go to 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. Apostle Paul is tremendous example of the mindset of anyone who would share the gospel. And it's something that I need to take to heart and probably do better at as well. But I want you to appreciate what he says. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be taker of it with you. Paul says, I'll do anything, with the exception of avoiding the law of Christ, right? That's part of that discussion is, I'm not going to abandon the law of Christ. Everyone's under the law of Christ and subject to it. But when it comes to trying to preach to the Jew, I'll become a Jew if that's what it takes. If it's a Gentile, I'll become a Gentile. If it means I need to speak the language of the weak, I'll do that as well. Paul says you cannot limit yourself to just one or two ways that you're willing to go about sharing the message of the gospel and say, well, if people won't accept it that way, then I'm not going to do it anymore. Right? Paul challenges us. Sometimes you got to do something different. Sometimes you may have to communicate to folks in a manner in which they can appreciate. A Gentile's not going to appreciate a lengthy history of the Jewish heritage, right? You're not necessarily going to convict the heart of a Gentile by taking them back to the days of Moses and walking them through, or go back to Abraham and walk them through. Because a Gentile at the end of the day is saying, I'm not part of that heritage, right? Now, I'm not saying the Old Testament isn't beneficial to the Gentile. That's not my point. My point is, Paul says, I became to the Jew a Jew, to the Gentile a Gentile, to the weak a weak. I'll do something different depending on the audience, the circumstance, the situation that I'm in. Sometimes you got to cast your net on the other side. Sometimes you got to do something different. If the communication isn't working, if people aren't hearing, aren't understanding, then it might mean that I need to step away for a moment and think, okay, how can I reach them in their terminology and in the world they are living? It's important for us, when what I'm doing isn't effective, to maybe take the time to reevaluate that. When I'm being led into sin, it's time to do something different. In Proverb 1 and verse 10, great little text, simplistic thought. In Proverb 1 and verse 10, where he simply said, the Proverbs did, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Do something different. Isn't that what he's saying? And they're trying to lure you and entice you into participating in things that you know are sinful in the eyes of God. You know what the Bible has said about that. You know what God's purposes for you would be. Do not consent. Do something different. Too often we find ourselves lending our voice to very paths and choices that we know aren't right. We know God would not desire them. We know that they're outside of the realm of what God would want. And yet we lend our voice and we consent to it over and over and over again. The next time someone says, well, it won't hurt. One time won't hurt you. Surely it'll be okay. Everyone else is doing it. Everyone can't be wrong. When they throw all those enticements at you, do something different. And that something different may be even extreme. It may mean you have to get away from those people who continually try to entice you. Doing something different may mean quit letting them have influence on you. Doing something different may mean I have to cut off some folks because they're continually trying to get me to go down these paths, and I'm continually having to resist and fight off those temptations, and I might need a change to get away from those things that are leading me into sin on a daily basis. When I'm being led into sin, do something different. And let me add this. And when I see what I'm doing is hurting me, quit doing that. Right? In Proverbs 13, verse 15, he said, good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. The way of the unfaithful is hard. When the choices and decisions and paths that I'm choosing are hurting me, quit doing that. That fellow one time said he knew a fellow that loved to eat hot peppers, but they were hurting his belly every time he ate them. Somebody said, well, start taking some Tums. Maybe that'd help you. Next time they saw him, he said he had a wad full of hot peppers on this side of his cheek and a wad of Tums on this side of his cheek. No, that's a time to do something different, right? Why do you keep hurting yourself? Why do you keep doing something that you know is going to cause you problems? And we do that, don't we? I could go around the room right now, and I could probably, and every person here knows there's something that if you eat it, it's not going to work well with you later that night, is it? You know it, and you still eat that, don't you? Now flip that into the spiritual realm for a moment. We do it with sin, and we do it with bad behaviors, and we do it with choices. We know it's hurting us. We know it's weakening us spiritually. We know it's affecting my faith. We know it's hurting my confidences in my relationship with God. If we're honest, we know that these choices and decisions that we're making are hurting us spiritually. And I keep doing that. Why? Why do I continue to make those choices and decisions? When I can look in God's Word and I wonder, well, what's wrong with my faith? What's wrong with my connection with the Father? Why am I not praying like I used to? And why am I not as interested in spiritual things as I once was? And we go through all that narrative. And we might actually find out, well, it's because I'm choosing behaviors and things that are harming that relationship. And it's time to do something different. When I'm guilty, it's time to do something different. You recall David, right? Nathan comes to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, he gives him that account of a man who would take his servant's lamb to offer for his guests, would take something that belonged to somebody else. David says, you tell me who that guy is, and I'll take care of him. That's the Brian Price translation, by the way. And what's he say? Nathan says to him, thou art the man. You're the one, David. Thou art the man. You're the one who has taken some in relationship to Bathsheba. You're the one who took a man's wife away from him. You're the one who's made a choice. When I recognize my guilt sometimes when it comes to sin and practices that are wrong in the eyes of God, then I need to be willing to be honest about that. I'm guilty. I'm the problem here. And it's time to do something different. I'm the one who's making poor decisions. I love that scene. You know, when Jesus is talking to His disciples, and He's talked about one was going to become a betrayer of them. And what I appreciate about that scene is one by one, those apostles come to Jesus and they say, Lord, is it I? Could it possibly be me that's going to betray you? Lord, is it I? And it's interesting because then Judas, the only one who knew where the guilt belonged, besides Jesus, the only one among the apostles who knew where the guilt belonged, he comes and says, Lord, is it I? And Jesus says, Thou hast said. The unfortunate thing is that Judas didn't get it soon enough to make the changes that he should have for his own personal benefit. When I'm guilty, don't keep doing the same things. Don't stay in the guilty path. Don't stay in the very same things that you know are creating the problems and difficulties. When I'm guilty, do something different. Pray that I be forgiven. Pray that God forgives and cleanses me. And begin to walk a different path. When I'm educated through Scripture, you know, all of us are susceptible to have a misunderstanding about a passage or a text. I could share with you a couple of texts right now that years ago that I would preach a certain way, and somebody was willing to come and sit down with me, and we open and I come to a different conclusion out of those very same texts about what should be taught concerning that. There's not perfection in any one of us in this room when it comes to our understanding of the Scriptures, and it's beneficial sometimes to sit down and open the Bible together and maybe get a greater appreciation. Here's an example of something just like that here in Acts chapter 18 and verse 24. He said, A certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures. Keep in mind, the only Scriptures he would have had at that time were the Old Testament law. The New Testament's just being fulfilled and written. He comes to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord in relationship to the coming Messiah, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside, explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. I'm going to make a necessary inference, we call it sometimes here. If they commend him after the conversation, the only fair conclusion I believe can be made is that he did something different in his teaching. When they shared with him a greater understanding of baptism in Jesus rather than the baptism of John, and then they commend him when he goes off to begin to preach and teach, I believe the only fair conclusion that can be made is that he began to preach more accurately the fullness of the gospel message of Jesus Christ. When we learn something more accurately, just do something different. Don't be upset or become difficult or angry over that. When the Bible educates me in a better way and I begin to gain a better understanding, and it may very well be in conflict with something that I originally thought or something that I may have even originally taught. Here was a man, a great man, a mighty man, an eloquent man, knowledgeable in the Scriptures, but he had been teaching for a period of time the wrong thing as it relates to the baptism of John. When he heard a greater and clearer understanding, he began to present it in a more accurate way. I appreciate about that. About Apollos here. He began to do something different. He didn't say, well, listen, all I know is the baptism of John, and that's what I'm going to do. Once he understood more accurately, he changed and took a different approach. When God says, do something different. I'm going to run these scriptures very quickly. But Romans 12, verse 21. Romans 12, verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. When God says, right? Quit trying to overcome evil with evil. You overcome evil with good. If I've been trying it the opposite way, God says do something different. In James chapter 4 and verse 7. In James chapter 4 and in verse 7, he said, therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. If I've been submitting to the devil and resisting God, then do something different. It's time for me to make changes. Galatians 5 and verse 14. He said, for all the law was fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If I haven't been loving my neighbor as myself, do something different. When God has spoken clearly, things like these narratives, and I find myself in opposition to what God would want for me, when I find myself at odds with what God has instructed me in, it's time to do something different. And so often in our lives, we need to appreciate the moments where it's time to do something different. When it's time for us to recognize that the path I've chosen, the decisions I've made, the choices I've been electing are not what God would want from me. Or maybe there's a moment where the Scriptures are beginning to be more vivid to me and I begin to see more clearly what maybe I've misunderstood or just never understood at all in the past. But once they begin to be clearer, then I want to respond to it and react to it and fulfill it. When God gives them very specific commands like don't overcome evil with evil. When He says submit to me and resist the devil. Then I'm going to do those things. When I feel trapped in the belly of a fish, I'm not going to just stay there. I'm going to pray. And I'm going to beseech the Father and I'm going to plead for His forgiveness. And I'm going to ask that He vomit me out on dry land so I can start over again. Comes to preaching and teaching of the gospel. I chose not to walk this path with you this morning in this study, but I believe there's a tremendous example that we could apply that to the work of the church as well. That sometimes we need to be willing to take a pause and say, is what we're doing being effective? Is what we're doing working? And if it's not, then being willing to say it's time to do something different. That doesn't mean, well, this message isn't working, so let's change it. That's not what I'm saying. This is the only thing that's got to stay true, right? The only thing that has to stay true is the message. But there may be times where we have to say to ourselves, let's do something different in order to proclaim that message. And we'll save that for another study. If you're sitting there this morning recognizing it's time for change, it's time to cast your net on the right side. It's time to try and do something different because what I'm doing is leading me further away from God. What I'm doing is leading me away from my relationship with Him. And we can help you today. Or maybe it's time to step out into His promises, find remission of sins through baptism, or if we can encourage you and pray for you today. We'd be glad to do that and help you in any way possible to step back into your relationship with God. If we could do that with you, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?